I don't remember the first time Mr. Beaumont looked at me the way a man looks at something he's already decided belongs to him, because on a place like Beaumont, every look is ownership if you live long enough under it. But I do remember the night he stopped calling me girl like I was a tool and started saying Eliza like he was testing how my name tasted in his mouth, as if naming me could make what he wanted feel cleaner. Mississippi, 1851. Late summer, the kind of heat that turns the air thick and keeps the house quiet, because even anger gets tired, the cicadas loud enough to bury your thoughts, and the big house smelling like lamp oil and sweat and old money that wasn't as solid as folks in town pretended. I was 23 then, a house servant, which sounds soft until you understand it just means you're close enough to see everything and powerless enough to stop nothing. It means you know which board on the porch squeaks and which drawer in the pantry sticks. You know the mistress's napkin folds and the master's whiskey level. You know the tone of a bell ring that means her and the one that means someone's in a mood and you'd better move. Like you're not made of flesh. I grew up here, in the quarters first, then in the shadow of the kitchen door, then inside the house where the floors are polished and the walls are thin and every room has rules that don't apply to T.H.E. people who wrote them, to the others. In the quarters I was Lisa from the house, useful and suspect at the same time. The one who could sometimes smuggle leftover bread or a scrap of soap and sometimes carried messages that made someone's stomach drop because the master's words travel faster than a whip when he wants them to. To the overseer I was nothing but a moving part, not worth learning beyond whether I could be threatened into speed. To the ledger in Mr. Beaumont's desk I was ink, a line he could add or cross out. Female, age about 23, house servant. And there's a kind of violence in that neatness because it makes you small enough to fit on paper. The only place I was full-sized was inside my own head. And even that felt dangerous because thinking is a habit you can't show too much on. White folks, not if you want to keep your teeth and your family and whatever small breathing space you can carve out by being quiet. My mother taught me to keep my face still, to let my eyes see without asking, to speak only when spoken to. And she taught me something else too. Something she never said straight because straight talk could get you sold or killed. She taught me that men like Mr. Beaumont don't start by hitting, not the ones who've learned manners. They start by offering, by making a trap sound like a bargain, by turning your hunger and your fear and the people you love into coins they can spend. My mother died 3 summers before that night. Fever took her fast. And grief on a plantation is another thing you learn to hide, because the work doesn't stop and the master doesn't care, and the only kindness you get is a hand on your shoulder from someone who can't afford more. After she died I kept my brother close, not close enough to draw attention, close enough to watch him. Because boys get pulled into fields and barns and into a man's temper the way a nail gets pulled toward a magnet, and I had seen too many families split over small things, a debt, a bad harvest, a man in town needing cash, a wife wanting new curtains and pretending she didn't know where the money came from. And that was part of it too, the money, because Beaumont Place wasn't as rich as it looked from the road. The parlor paint was fading, the roof needed work. The ledger in the study stayed open late with numbers marching like soldiers, and a man who can't pay his bills is often a man who looks for someone weaker than him to carry the weight of his shame. Mrs. Margaret Beaumont used to move through the house like she owned the air itself, neat, controlled, her voice soft but sharp, and she noticed things. She noticed when sugar ran low, and when a servant's hands got smoother, and when her husband drank too early in the day, and she had a way of cutting without raising her voice. She was the one who brought me into the house full-time when I was younger, said I had hands for finer work, said I could learn. And in her mind I think she believed she was making me safer by keeping me close. As if a cage with clean floors isn't still a cage. Then she left, and folks in the quarters whispered reasons. Sick sister in Charleston, sea air for her nerves, too much heat, too much disappointment. And the truth can hold more than one thing at once, because women like her could be sick and could be tired and could be running from the way a house changes when a man feels unobserved. When she was gone, the big house felt hollow, not peaceful, hollow like a mouth missing teeth, and Mr. Beaumont started staying up later, reading his ledger and drinking, and when he spoke, his words had an edge, like he'd been chewing on them. I learned to make myself smaller, quieter. I moved like a shadow, because when a master is angry you don't want to be the thing he sees, and it worked until it didn't. That night I was clearing dishes after a late supper, and he was alone at the head of the table, collar loose, vest unbuttoned, whiskey bottle nearly empty, ledger open like it was the only thing he trusted, and I was wiping a smear of gravy from the tablecloth the way Mrs. Beaumont liked. Careful, careful, when he said, leave it, and my hands froze because a command that doesn't fit the room is a warning. I asked if he wanted coffee, because a servant's safest language is service, and he cut me off and told me to sit, and my stomach tightened because he wasn't asking, and he said my name. The full thing, Eliza, not girl, not you there, and it hit me like a slap because being named by him felt like being touched. He poured himself another drink and asked if I wanted some like he was joking, then laughed at his own joke and said it was ridiculous how the house keeps rules about lips on a glass but breaks bigger rules without blinking, and I felt my throat close because I understood exactly what he meant, and because understanding never helps you. It only tells you how far you are from safety. He talked about remembering me as a child, hiding under the table when his friends came, and he said I was surviving, and he said it like he respected it. Like survival was a talent he could admire and then use. He said his wife wasn't coming back soon, maybe not next month, maybe not the next. Sea air is good for her nerves, and he said nerves like it was a weakness he could punish her for even from far away. And he said the house was full of echoes and bills, and I realized he wanted someone to blame and someone to fill space, and both of those can be the same person when you're owned. Then he told me to stand and turn around, and I did, because your body stops being yours long before anyone lays hands on it. It stops being yours the first time you learn that refusal is a story you're not allowed to tell. I felt his eyes move over me like a hand, and I wanted to disappear into the floorboards. But the floorboards don't open for girls like me, they only creak. He said I moved quieter than any woman he'd known, that the house ran smoother when I was in it, fire lit on time, coffee hot, shirts pressed, no complaining. And he was building a case the way men do when they want to call taking something a kind of logic. He was telling himself I was necessary, so he could pretend he wasn't cruel. He stepped close enough that I could smell the whiskey and sweat, and he said he was tired of sleeping alone in a big empty bed in a big empty house. And he said he could go into town and find some woman, but he didn't want strangers. He wanted someone who knew where the cups were, who wouldn't talk nonsense at breakfast. And there it was. The way he made my usefulness sound like intimacy. The way he reduced my person down to convenience. He said I was a good woman and I kept his house like it was mine, and I might as well keep his nights too. And the words didn't even pretend to offer choice. They just stepped around it. I tried to speak, tried to push a no into the air without saying it, but no is a word that makes masters turn into storms. And I thought of the whip that used to hang in the dining room corner years ago like a reminder. I thought of my brother sleeping 3 cabins over. I thought of what a sail south meant, not just distance but disappearance. And he watched my silence the way you watch a door you're about to break through. He said, softer, like he was negotiating something fair, that he wasn't asking me to be his wife. The law would never see me that way. But under this roof, in this room, when he called, I could be his second wife, and I felt sick because the phrase sounded almost gentle, but it was just a ribbon tied around a chain. He promised things the way men like him do. Better food than the field hands. Staying in the house. If there were children they'd stay close. he wouldn't sell them off for the first good price. And then he called himself not a monster, just a man trying to keep his world from falling apart. And he said world like my body was part of his furniture. My mother's warnings came back then, and Lahi the midwife's too. If a white man ever starts calling you special, you run. If you can't run, you hide. If you can't hide, you make your face a mask and pray. And I couldn't run. There was nowhere in Mississippi that wasn't full of men like him. I couldn't hide because he owned the doors. So I did the only thing left. I kept my face still and asked the question that was already answered. What if I say no? And his eyes hardened fast, the softness gone like it had never been there. And he said he could send me back to the fields, or sell me south, or make life uncomfortable for my kin. And in that moment, he didn't need to raise his voice because the law raised it for him. The law stood behind his words like a crown. He called it an offer, a better place in a bad world. And I understood the trick, that the bad world was his, and the better place was just to close a corner inside it. I bowed my head because that is what survival looks like when you can't fight. It looks like agreement. It looks like quiet. It looks like your mouth saying yes while your insides go cold. And I whispered, yes, sir. And he exhaled like he'd been carrying a burden and set it down onto me. He touched my cheek with the back of his fingers like I was fragile, like he hadn't just threatened my family, and he told me to go to his room, blow out the lamp. He'd be there shortly. And I walked down the hallway on legs that didn't feel like mine, past the portrait of Mrs. Beaumont on the stairs with her painted eyes watching, and I remember thinking how a painting can stare and still be powerless. How a woman can leave a house and her name can stay nailed to it. How I was the one who had to carry the weight of her absence. That was the first night, and people think the first night is the whole story. But the first night is just where the story stops being hypothetical. The cruel part is how fast it becomes routine. How the house rearranges itself around a wrongness until the wrongness feels like part of the furniture. In the quarters they noticed I wasn't in my bunk. They noticed the way I moved less in the yard, the better dress, the heavier shadows under my eyes. But nobody asked straight because straight questions get you hurt, and because everybody already knew what the answer would sound like. In the big house Mr. Beaumont slept easier, woke in better moods, said my name more often, started saying we when he talked about the house. We keep it running. We keep the book straight, and hearing him say we made my skin crawl because he was stealing even that, the word that belongs to equals. He stopped calling for me in front of others the way he did at first. He learned discretion. And discretion is the master's best friend, because it keeps the town's eyes clean, while the house stays dirt. Why, when he wanted me, it was a knock that wasn't loud, a footstep that knew which boards don't squeak, a hand on my arm in a hallway that looked gentle if you didn't know what pressure feels like. And he kept his voice low, always low. Like secrecy was a kind of tenderness. He would say small things afterward, things meant to smooth the edges. You're safe here. I won't let anyone touch you. I'm keeping you close. And every time he said safe, I heard the threat underneath. Safe as long as I please him. Safe as long as I don't embarrass him. Safe as long as his wife stays away and the town stays blind. I learned to move through my days like a person split in two. One part of me pouring coffee, folding linens, polishing silver, and the other part of me counting how many steps from the kitchen to his door, counting how many seconds between the sound of his boots and the turn of a latch, counting the ways a body can feel present and absent at the same time. The strangest part was how ordinary the house stayed. How the sun still rose and the bell still rang, and the dishes still needed washing, and the men in town still tipped their hats to Mr. Beaumont on Sue. And days like he was a decent Christian. And I realized then that the cruelty wasn't only what he did, it was how many people could live next to it without naming it. Months passed, and the arrangements settled into the bones of the house. And I started to understand that the worst thing about being used isn't the moment of use, It's the way it teaches you your future will be built out of other people's appetites. Then one morning the air tasted like rain and something else, and a letter arrived, seal broken, short neat line of ink, and I didn't see the letter in my hands, but I saw it in his. In a tremor he tried to hide, and he said, almost to himself, "Well, that's that," like he was talking about a bill coming due, and I knew before he even spoke her name that Mrs. Margaret Beaumont was returning on the 1st of next month. And the house stiffened around the news the way a body stiffens before a blow, and I stood there with my hands damp from dishwater, looking at the doorway that led upstairs. And I understood something that made my mouth go dry. A second wife is a role that only exists in the dark, and the dark was about to be interrupted. I knew the house would choose sides before any of us spoke, because houses like Beaumont always do. They bend toward the name nailed to the deed, not the bodies that keep them breathing. And when Margaret Beaumont's carriage rolled up the drive, I felt it in my stomach before I saw her, felt the way the rooms straightened themselves, the way the servants' voices dropped half a tone, the way Mr. Beaumont's temper folded inward and sharpened. I stood with the others on the front steps, because that was where I was told to stand, hands folded, eyes lowered, my dress clean and plain. Nothing about me announcing where I had been sleeping or whose bed had learned the shape of my back. And when she stepped down from the carriage, she did not rush or falter. She moved like a woman who expects the world to adjust to her pace, and she said my name the way you read a list, not unkind, not warm, just precise, and that precision cut, because it meant she was already measuring. She looked at me once, quick and complete, and I knew she saw the small changes, the smoother hands, the way my eyes didn't move the same. And she said the house looked settled, and paused long enough to let the word mean what it meant. And Mr. Beaumont smiled the careful smile of a man trying to look relieved, while bracing for judgment. And I carried trunks upstairs and watched her reclaim the bedroom. Watched her fingers check drawers and hangers, and the way she knew when something had been touched, even if it was put back. And when she asked if anyone had been in her things, I told the truth the way servants do. Only the parts that can't hurt you right away. Only to dust, ma'am. And she asked how I found them, and I said, neat, and she smiled like someone who has confirmed a suspicion without needing proof. For the first days she reasserted herself quietly, moved furniture, replaced dishes, took back spaces that had learned my habits. And Mr. Beaumont drank more and watched her with a jaw that stayed tight. And I watched both of them, because watching is how you stay alive when you are owned. She rang for a maid in the mornings, and sometimes I answered because the house was short-handed or because he had ordered it so. And the first time I came into her dressing room alone, she closed the door and asked me how long I'd been sleeping in the house, and I tried to give her the kind of answer that slides off questions, near the kitchen, Mum, and she corrected me without raising her voice. Under this roof, how long? And there was no safe version of the truth left, so I told her what I could. Since late spring, so wanted someone near at night, and she asked what he needed. And I said coffee and fires, because those are the words women like her can hear without having to rearrange their world. She stood and told me to roll up my sleeve, and my hands shook because I knew what she would see, and because I knew what she would think. And when the marks showed, she asked if the overseer did it, and I said no, and she asked who touches you like that, and the truth burned my tongue, and I swallowed it, because truth is not a shield when the law is against you. And I told her I fell, and she told me women know finger marks when they see them, and that she was mistress of the house, and from now on I would sleep in the small room by the linen closet, with the door open, and I would not answer if he called after sundown, and if he insisted I would come to her first. And relief and terror crashed together in me, because rules can protect you, and rules can also paint a target. The argument rose that night from the study in sharp edges, words I didn't need to hear clearly to understand. My house, my reputation, slave, second wife. and I sat on the narrow bed with my hands over my ears, knowing that sound travels where it wants, and that men like him believe volume is a form of truth. The rules held for a few nights, and those nights taught me something worse than fear. They taught me anticipation. Because waiting for a door not to open is its own kind of torture. And when the storm came, it did what storms always do on plantations. It gave men cover and women warnings, and I lay in the small room counting breaths when I heard my name. Low, close. And I stayed still because Margaret had told me not to answer, and because sometimes obedience, Tim. One rule means breaking another. And the latch turned and the door opened, and he came in like he had every right to be there, because in his mind he did. And he told me this was his house and his arrangements, and his wife did not get to undo what kept the place from falling apart. And he touched me and told me not to worry, because she was sleeping, and because storms cover noise. And I felt the old cold settle in my bones, because there is no language for no, when the man hearing T owns the sentence. I tried to make myself small, and he told me I was what kept him from drowning between rules and respectability. And the bed creaked and the room shrank, and I knew then that rules only matter when someone is willing to enforce them, and he was not. I did not scream, because screaming is a decision you make when you know someone will come, and on Beaumont Place sound does not guarantee witnesses. And then the door opened and the room filled with light, and Margaret stood there and said his name like it weighed something. And time did that strange stretching thing where everything sharpens and blurs at once. And she told him to get off me and to leave, and he stumbled back, because even men like him recognize certain lines when they are crossed in front of the wrong person. And she told him this was her house, and he would not decide anything half undressed in front of me. And he left muttering that they would talk like it was a disagreement and not a crime. And when the door closed, the storm quieted and the room felt too big and too small at the same time. She told me to stand and asked if he forced me. And the question landed hard, because it came from a woman who understood force is not only fists, and I told her the truth in the only way I could. He is my master. I am not allowed to say no. He said he could sell my kin. And she said of course he did, and called his words tidy names for filthy things. And she did not apologize, and she did not comfort me the way people think comfort should look. She told me what would happen next, where I would sleep, when I would move, how I would never be alone again. And if he forced his way into a room, I would scream loud enough to embarrass him, because embarrassment is the only language men like him respect. I asked what she would do, and she said she would remind him in every room whose name sat where his did in town ledgers and church registers, and that she would walk into any room she pleased, especially when he thought it did not belong to her. And I asked if she would sell me, and she said no, and told me not to mistake his attention for protection. And that was the closest thing to mercy I had ever been given by someone who still owned me. The weeks after were a lesson in how quickly men retreat when watched, and how quickly they advance when they think they are not. He tried twice to catch me alone, and each time a door opened, or a voice called my name. And Margaret's presence became a wall he could not step through without leaving marks. And at dinner she smiled and refilled his glass, and in private, she cut away his excuses one by one. And he drank more and went to town more, and came back smelling like perfume he could pretend was less dangerous because it did not live under his roof. And my life narrowed to corridors and kitchens and rules layered on rules, until I felt like a path worn thin by feet that never belonged to me. When the sickness came in the mornings, I tried to pretend it was nothing, because denial is a skill you learn early. But the midwife knew before I did, and said it plain, and my mouth went dry, because there is no safe way to be pregnant by a master. And when I told Margaret, she did not hesitate. She opened the household ledger and wrote a line neat enough to pass inspection. She named a stable hand as the father, because lies survive when they fit the world's expectations. And she told me the baby would stay alive, and that was all she promised. And when the child was born, and she held her first and named her something common enough to disappear into. I understood the shape of the bargain. My body had been used and my truth had been erased, and the price of survival was silence that would last longer than any storm. Mr. Beaumont looked at the baby and saw himself, and chose not to see, because choosing not to see is another privilege men like him carry. And life went on the way it always does on places like Beaumont. The house intact, the ledger clean. The story told in town smooth enough to swallow. And I learned that injustice does not end, it settles, it becomes furniture, and you live around it if you want to breathe. After the child was born, the house did not soften. It only learned a new way to hide its sharp edges, and that was the lesson I did not expect, that survival does not come with relief, it comes with maintenance, with constant vigilance. With rules layered so thick, they feel like walls until you realize walls can also trap you inside. They named her Anna because Margaret said it was a name that could belong to anyone and therefore to no one. A name that would not raise questions in town or turn heads in church. And when she placed that child in my arms, I felt something dangerous stir in me, not hope, not joy, but a fierce clarity that made everything else in the house look like a lie. Because the truth was suddenly small and warm and breathing against my chest, and everything else was noise. Margaret kept her word in the way women like her do, not with tenderness but with control. She made sure the ledger matched the story and the story matched what the town expected. She reminded me often that the lie was the only thing keeping my child alive, and I learned quickly that gratitude is another form of silence. You learn to say thank you without ever letting your mouth shape the words, because words can be used against you later. Mr. Beaumont did not touch me again the way he had before, not openly, not in the dark corners of the house. But he did not leave me alone either. He watched, he hovered. He let his presence linger, just long enough to remind me that restraint was his choice, not my safety. And there is a cruelty in being spared by someone who could still destroy you if it suited them. When he passed me in the hall, his hand sometimes brushed my sleeve and the pressure was light enough to deny and heavy enough to claim. And he smiled the kind of smile men use when they want to remind you that you owe them something you can never repay. Margaret noticed everything and corrected nothing directly. She adjusted schedules, moved people, placed me where eyes were always present. And in doing so, she made it clear that my safety was not a right but a managed condition. Something she could grant and withdraw depending on how well I followed her instructions. I learned to read her moods the way I read his, because power does not always wear the same face. And sometimes the person standing between you and harm also stands between you and truth. The town accepted the story without effort. They accepted it because it fit what they already believed about people like me, that we paired off carelessly, that children came and went without consequence, that nothing worth noting happened in kitchens and quarters. And watching them smile at my daughter made something twist in me, because I knew how easily they would have smiled at her sale if the ledger had told a different lie. Church Sundays were the worst because everyone was clean and polite and pretending. Mr. Beaumont sat beside his wife and sang hymns about mercy with a voice that never shook. And I stood at the back with Anna wrapped tight and listened to men pray for order, while knowing exactly what kind of order they meant. The kind where women like me keep quiet, so men like him can sleep. As Anna grew, I counted not her milestones but her vulnerabilities. The way her skin caught the light, the way her eyes mirrored his more than mine, the way strangers commented on her quickness. And every compliment felt like a warning, because attention is a currency on a plantation and children are easy to spend. Margaret taught me how to keep Anna small in ways that would not look like neglect. How to keep her from drawing the wrong kind of interest. And in those lessons I understood the shape of the bargain again. My child would live, but she would live carefully, quietly, and always under someone else's permission. Mr. Beaumont's moods grew harder to predict as the years pressed on him. Debts did not disappear just because a baby was born. and men who cannot control their fortunes often tighten their grip on people instead. He argued with Margaret more often, and in those arguments I heard my own name spoken like a problem that had been managed but not solved, and I understood then that to him I was unfinished business, a thing he had owned and been forced to relinquish, and men like him do not forgive that kind of loss. Once, when Anna was just old enough to toddle, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her play at my feet, and he said nothing for a long time. And the silence pressed so hard, I thought my chest would cave in. And then he said, "She had his eyes," and I said nothing because denial is safest when it is complete. And Margaret appeared behind him and placed a hand on his arm and said, "Children favor whoever feeds them most." And he laughed and turned away, and I understood how fragile that protection was, how it depended on timing and witnesses and the careful choreography of a woman who was protecting her marriage first and my child second. There were nights I lay awake listening to the house breathe, listening for footsteps that did not come. And those nights taught me that fear does not vanish when danger retreats. It only changes its posture. It sits with you. It watches with you. It waits for the smallest opening. The older Anna grew, the more I felt the walls closing, because children do not stay invisible forever. They grow voices and questions. They grow opinions. And opinions are dangerous things for children like mine. So I taught her to watch before she spoke, to hold her hand still, to never run when someone called her name. Lessons I learned the hard way and hated myself for passing on, because every lesson that kept her alive also trained her to accept a world that would never be fair to her. Margaret grew sharper as she aged, less patient with her husband's excuses, more precise in her control of the house. And sometimes I wondered if she saw in Anna a future version of her own confinement, a girl born into a role she did not choose, and would spend her life managing instead of escaping. But she never spoke of it, and I never asked, because questions are luxuries. The closest we came to truth was in the small things, the way Margaret's hand lingered on Anna's head a second longer than necessary, the way she corrected anyone who spoke too freely about my child, the way she made sure Anna learned letters, just enough to be useful but not enough to be threatening, because knowledge is another thing men like Mr. Beaumont like to own. There were moments I considered running, moments that came uninvited in the night, but I knew the geography of Mississippi and the price of being caught. And I knew that running with a child was not an act of bravery, but a calculation, and every calculation ended the same way, with my daughter hungry or hunted or dead. And so I stayed and learned to measure time not in seasons but in risks avoided. Injustice does not announce itself every day. Some days it looks like routine, and those days are the hardest because they teach you to accept what should never be accepted. They teach you that survival is not the same as living, and that knowledge sat heavy in my chest as Anna grew tall enough to light lamps without help and clever enough to notice the way adults stopped talking when she entered a room. She asked me once why Mr. Beaumont never looked at her the way he looked at other children, and I told her it was because he did not know her well, and the light tasted familiar and bitter. And I realized then that my life had become a series of lies stacked so carefully that removing one would collapse everything, and that was the true cruelty of Beaumont Place, not the acts themselves but the structure that made those acts necessary. Years passed and nothing resolved. There was no reckoning, no justice, no moment where the scales evened. Only the slow grinding of time and the quiet understanding that the world would keep turning exactly why as it was designed to. And I watched Anna move through that world with a grace I did not teach her and a caution I did. And every day I wondered how much of her was shaped by love and how much by fear, and whether there was a difference on a place like this. Mr. Beaumont aged into bitterness and entitlement, Margaret into control and vigilance, and I aged into a woman who knew too much and could say too little. And if there is anger in me now, it is not the kind that burns bright and then fades. It is the kind that settles deep and waits, Because injustice that goes unpunished does not disappear. It multiplies, it teaches itself to the next generation. And as I watched my daughter sleep in the narrow bed beside mine, I understood with a clarity that hurt more than any hand ever had that Beaumont Place had taken more than my body. It had taken the possibility of a future where survival did not have to be earned every single day. The years did not change the rules. They only polished them until they looked like tradition. And by the time I could speak in full sentences, the house had settled into a rhythm that felt permanent. As if what happened to me had always been meant to happen, and what would happen to her was already being quietly prepared. Mr. Beaumont stopped pretending restraint was virtue and started treating it like generosity. The kind of generosity that expects gratitude without ever asking for it outright. And every time he passed me without touching me, he made sure I noticed. Made sure I understood that mercy was something he chose daily and could withdraw just as easily. And that knowledge sat between us like a third presence, unseen but heavy. Margaret maintained her authority with the precision of a woman who knows exactly how little room she has to maneuver. She kept accounts clean. She kept visitors satisfied. She kept her husband from embarrassing himself in ways the town would not forgive, and in doing so she kept me and my child alive, but never free. And I learned that protection and imprisonment can wear the same face depending on where you stand. Anna grew observant in a way that frightened me. She noticed the difference between how white children were corrected and how she was silenced. She noticed how compliments stopped just short of affection, how adults praised her usefulness more than her curiosity, and I found myself correcting her before others could, teaching her to lower her eyes, to soften her voice, to smile at the right moments. Because I knew too well what happens to children who forget where they are. There were moments, rare but sharp, when Mr. Beaumont's temper slipped its leash, not at me directly, but at the house itself, slammed doors, broken glass, shouted words about debt and disrespect and ingratitude. And in those moments I saw clearly how close violence always lived, how it paced just beneath the surface waiting for permission. And I understood that the only reason it did not fall on me again was not repentance but inconvenience. Once, after a visitor from town made a joke about house girls knowing their place too well, Mr. Beaumont laughed, and his laughter told me more than any threat ever could. It told me that whatever restraint he practiced at home did not extend to how he spoke of me elsewhere, that my body was still currency in rooms I was not allowed to enter. And the knowledge that my violation could be traded as humor made my skin crawl in a way no touch had. Margaret heard the joke too and said nothing in the moment, and later that night she corrected the seating at dinner, so I would never be left alone with guests again. And I understood then how power works for women like her, not through confrontation, but through rearrangement, and how fragile that rearrangement was, dependent entirely on her presence and her will. Anna asked questions I could not answer without lying. Why she could not run in the yard like the other children. Why she had to sleep where she could be heard. Why certain rooms were never for her. And each answer I gave her folded another layer of the house around us, tightening the space where we were allowed to exist. The worst moments were the ordinary ones, the mornings where nothing happened, where the sun rose and breakfast was served, and the world looked almost peaceful. Because those were the moments that threatened to dull my anger, to make me accept that this was simply how life worked, and I clung to my anger like a hidden blade, because anger, unlike hope, does not lie to you. There was a night, years after Margaret's return, when Mr. Beaumont came home drunk from town and stood too long in the doorway of my room, Anna asleep beside me, and he said nothing, he did nothing. He only watched, and that watching was worse than action because it reminded me that restraint was not transformation, it was delay, and that the only thing standing between us was the thin wall of his wife's authority and his own calculation of risk. Margaret appeared in the hallway then, not hurried, not loud, and asked if he needed something, and he turned away with a curse, and afterward she did not look at me. She only told me to keep the door open and the lamp lit on nights like that. And I realized how small my safety was, how it depended on light and witnesses and the mood of a man who had already shown me what he was capable of. Time passed, as it always does, and the town continued to accept its version of the truth. The ledger remained clean, the church praised order, and my anger deepened into something steady and cold. Because outrage that has nowhere to go does not fade, it settles. It becomes part of your thinking, part of how you look at every kindness and every rule. Anna grew into a girl who understood more than she should and spoke less than she wanted, and sometimes I caught her watching Margaret with a mixture of fear and admiration. And I wondered what lessons she was drawing from the way a woman could command a house and still be trapped by it, from the way protection did not mean justice and survival did not mean dignity. Mr. Beaumont fell ill one winter, not enough to humble him, but enough to make him fearful, and fear made him cruel in smaller ways, sharper words, longer silences, looks that lingered just past politeness, and I understood then that men like him do not need strength to harm, they need only the belief that nothing will happen to them, and that belief was reinforced daily by the town, the law, the church, and the quiet cooperation of everyone who benefited from not asking questions. Margaret managed his illness with the same efficiency she managed everything else, and in watching her, I saw the truth that made my anger burn hotter, that even when women intervene, they do so inside a system built by men, and every victory is temporary, every protection conditional, and the cost is always borne by someone like me. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, no moment where Mr. Beaumont admitted what he had done. Because men who are protected by the world do not confess, they simply move on, and the world moves with them, leaving the rest of us to adapt or break. I adapted, because breaking would have taken my child with me, and adaptation is another word for surrender when you have no leverage, and I watched Anna learn the same skill. Watched her choose silence where curiosity lived, watched her calculate danger before joy, and I hated this place not only for what it did to me, but for how efficiently it prepared her to survive it. The injustice of Beaumont Place was not loud. It did not announce itself daily. It worked quietly, patiently, shaping lives in ways that could never be undone. And by the time Anna was nearly grown, I understood that nothing in this house would ever be resolved, that there would be no reckoning, only endings that looked like continuations, and the knowledge filled me with a resentment so deep it felt structural, as if the house itself had taught me how to hold it. I began to understand that the true cruelty was not the night I was first claimed, but the years afterward, the years where that claim echoed through every rule and every silence, shaping a future that would never be written down, but would be lived all the same. And as I watched Anna step carefully through a world designed to consume her if she misstepped, I knew with a certainty that left no room for comfort that whatever came next would not be justice. It would only be another version of endurance, and endurance, when it is all you are allowed, is its own kind of sentence. The end did not come the way people imagine endings, with a door closing or a body buried or a truth finally spoken. It came the way everything else at Beaumont Place came, quietly, legally, wrapped in language that made injustice sound like order. And by the time I understood what was happening, the decision had already been made in rooms I was not allowed to enter. Mr. Beaumont's illness worsened one spring, and with it his need to secure what he believed was his. He spoke often of legacies and debts and the foolishness of men who let their household slip after tea. They were gone, and when he spoke like that, he looked at Anna with a kind of calculation that made my stomach knot because I recognized the look. It was the same look he had worn when he decided my body would solve a problem for him. Margaret managed his decline with the same precision she had managed everything else. She sent letters, paid creditors, arranged visits, and I watched her face harden into something almost brittle, because fear does that to people who rely on control, It sharpens them until there is nothing left to soften. One afternoon she called me into the study and closed the door. And I knew before she spoke that whatever she was about to say would be framed as necessity, not choice. And she told me Mr. Beaumont had amended his papers, that there would be changes to the estate, that the law required certain distributions, and she spoke carefully, as if each word had been weighed for how much damage it could do without breaking the house entirely. She told me Anna would be sent away to work in town, apprenticed, she said, as if that word could disguise what it meant, as if distance and labor were gifts instead of separations. And she said it would keep her safe, safer than staying, safer than being noticed as she grew older. And I felt something tear inside me, because I had spent years shaping my child to survive this place, only to be told that survival required losing her anyway. I asked where she would go, and Margaret told me the name of a household I knew by reputation, a place where girls learned obedience early and left nothing behind that could tie them to home. And I understood then that this was not protection, it was disposal, a way to move a problem out of sight before it demanded acknowledgement. I said no, because sometimes a no comes out of you before you can stop it, and Margaret looked at me with something like pity and told me gently that I did not have the standing to refuse, that this was the only arrangement that would prevent worse outcomes, that the law would not see my grief and would not care, and that she was doing what she could within the limits she had. And in that moment I hated her, not because she was cruel, but because she was honest about how little she intended to do. Mr. Beaumont did not speak to me directly about it. He spoke through her, and through the papers, and through the quiet authority of a system that did not require his voice anymore. And that absence was its own insult, because it meant he no longer needed to threaten me. The machinery was already in motion. When I went to Anna that night and told her she would be leaving, she did not cry at first. She asked practical questions. Where would she sleep? Would I come? How often could she write? And I answered what I could, while feeling the weight of every lie I had ever told her settle into my chest, because I knew I would not be allowed to follow, and letters would be a privilege granted at someone else's discretion. And the truth was that once she left Beaumont Place, she would belong to another set of rules and another set of owners, and I would have no claim strong enough to reach her. The morning she was taken away, the house was orderly, the carriage waited, the driver looked bored, and Margaret stood by the door with a list in her hand, efficient to the last. And Mr. Beaumont watched from his chair, pale and satisfied, as if he had resolved something that had been troubling him. And when Anna clung to me, he told her not to fuss and told me to be grateful that she had been given an opportunity. And the word opportunity landed like a slap, because it was the same word he had used years ago when he explained why I should accept my place in his bed. I held my child as long as I was allowed, and then hands pried us apart gently, politely, the way the law prefers its violence delivered. And when the carriage rolled away, I did not scream, because screaming would not bring her back, and because I had learned too well what kinds of sounds matter in a place like this, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than any blow I had ever known. After she was gone, the house did not collapse, it did not mourn, it adjusted, rooms were reassigned, schedules changed, and my absence from certain spaces was noted only as an inconvenience. And I realized then the full measure of the injustice, that nothing about my suffering disrupted the order that had caused it. Nothing about my loss required explanation or repair. Mr. Beaumont died later that year without ever naming what he had done. He was buried with hymns and kind words, and men in town spoke of his struggles and his perseverance. And I stood at the edge of the crowd and listened to them praise a man whose legacy included my silence and my child's removal. And there was no moment where the truth rose up and demanded to be heard, because truths like mine do not interrupt ceremonies. They are expected to stay buried. Margaret inherited the house, and with it the authority she had always exercised in practice, and she called me in after the funeral and told me my position would remain the same, That stability was important after loss, and I understood the cruelty of that offer, that I was being asked to continue serving a place that had taken everything from me. And when I asked about Anna, she told me she was settled, and that it would be better not to stir old wounds by pressing for more, and her words made clear what the years had taught me, that stability for people like her is built on the quiet endurance of people like me. I lived on at Beaumont Place, because leaving would have meant abandoning the last threads that might someday lead me back to my child, and I learned to carry a different kind of anger then. Not the sharp fear of nightly footsteps or the constant calculation of proximity, but the slow burn of injustice that has been finalized and stamped and filed away. The anger of knowing that the world had seen what happened and chosen to call it order. Sometimes letters came, brief and careful, Anna's hand changing as she grew older, her words cautious, never naming what she endured. And I read between the lines, because I had taught her how to hide in plain language. And every letter was a reminder that my survival had cost her something I could never repay. People like to believe that time heals, that distance makes pain manageable. But what time did here was teach the house to forget, while I remembered everything, and memory became my only act of resistance, the only place where the truth could exist without permission. If there is a lesson in my life, it is not a comforting one. It is not about resilience as virtue or suffering as path to grace. It is this, that injustice does not require monsters. It requires systems that reward silence and call it peace, that allow men to act and women to manage and children to be moved like furniture, and that survival inside such systems is not a triumph. It is a compromise that leaves scars no ledger will ever record. I tell this now not because it changes anything, not because it will bring my child back or undo what was done to me, but because the world that allowed Beaumont Place to function still exists wherever power hides, behind manners and legality, and because silence, even when it keeps you alive, is never neutral. It always serves someone else, and I am done serving a truth that was never mine to begin with.